Welcome to the Better Call Daddy Show.
This is Big Daddy.
Oh my God, that's hysterical.
You're not going to believe this.
Oh my God.
5 stars.
5.5 stars.
Papa.
My dad is my hero.
Grandpa, are you ready?
I love a good happy ending.
Oh boy.
Hey.
It's a phony baloney.
And a tit for tatter.
Hey, a lot of these things, I don't know where you're getting them from. It sounds like they're coming from when I look in the mirrors.
Damn the public.
Damn the public.
Today's guest, April Rovero, is on a mission to warn families about the dangers of prescription drug abuse and dirty doctors after the tragic loss of her son. April, welcome.
Back in 2009, when Joey died, there wasn't a recognized opioid crisis per se, right? That evolved after. So what Joey died from were medications that had been prescribed to him 9 days earlier by a doctor. And the doctor gave him, first and only visit, she gave him 90 pills of 30 milligram strength oxycodone. She gave him 2 milligram strength Xanax, which is the strongest Xanax you can get. And that was a 30-day supply, so 30 pills of that, basically. She gave him 90 pills of Soma, which is a muscle relaxant. I don't know how much you know about this whole issue, but that's that particular combination of Soma, Xanax, and any kind of opioid, I learned after the fact is known as the Holy Trinity. It is a particular combination of drugs that is particularly potentially deadly because they're all central nervous system depressants, meaning that as they manage your stress, your anxiety, or your pain, or your tension, muscle tension, which is what the Soma is for, each one of them individually slow down your breathing at some level. They just naturally do that. So does alcohol. So when you mix any of those in combination with each other and or with alcohol, they can slow your breathing down to the point it stops. You go to bed, you go to sleep, and you don't wake up. And so that's what happened to my son. It took us 4.5 months to get his coroner's report back. And when we did, that included the toxicology report. We learned that he died basically from 1.5 pills of oxycodone, a pill of Xanax, and some alcohol. And the alcohol level was just over the legal driving level. So it's not like he was just drop dead drunk, right? So, first of all, we were just horrified. There was no history of addiction or, historical issues with Joey at all. Back in those days, the kids did use Facebook. They don't so much. They've kind of evolved off of that platform. But at the time, they used Facebook, and I was Joey's friend on Facebook. And so I'm always checking it out to see what's going on. And, what I saw was a lot of partying, obviously, going on the weekends and that sort of thing. And so the conversations we'd have almost every time we saw each other or talked to each other on the phone is like, don't drink too much, It's like, be careful with the alcohol. That was what I worried about. I had no idea that prescription drugs were being used in a party environment there. They were part of the party mix, we call it now. They were recreationally being used to get high with, etc. And I had zero idea of that. I didn't know how potentially dangerous they could be. I didn't know that a couple of pills could kill you, as happened to my son, if mixed with alcohol and each other. So first of all, we're horrified and just devastated, as you can imagine, with the loss of this amazing kid. He was just very, very bright, total, just everybody's friend, ready to graduate in 5 months from Arizona State University. So he's a senior, just about out of that university. And then the unthinkable happens after going all the way through high school, almost all the way through college. And here we have a dead son. It was just horrific. And then for me to learn that prescription drugs at such a level could take the life of this 21-year-old perfectly healthy young man was inconceivable to me. And so, as we're looking at this, as we, are coping with the, getting him back home, burying him the day after Christmas, because this happened just a week before Christmas in 2009. I just kept thinking, we've got to tell the world about this. We need to alert people, because if it can happen to our family, it can happen to anybody. We weren't a family that hardly ever had any prescription meds at all, much less, these heavy duty medications that, he passed away from. Another part of the story is that it took about 6.5, 7 years, but the doctor that prescribed the medication was ultimately convicted of second-degree murder in Joey's case. So she was arrested. She was convicted of his death, along with 2 other young men. and 5 other young men that had been under her care had also died. So I think there were 8 or 9 young people who had died, and she was charged at various levels, there were 3 second-degree murder charges, and the others were illegal prescribing, basically. Convicted of everything, though, and sentenced to 30 years to life in prison. So her case ended up being a very high-profile national case. And the good news about that was, of course, number one, I didn't want her ever prescribing again. I didn't care if she went to jail or not, but she needed to never prescribe again, because we learned, of course, over time that people from every county in Southern California were flocking to her office. She was running a pill mill and prescribing indiscriminately to all these young people that were, many of them getting addicted and ultimately dying from her medication and her treatment. Yeah, so she's serving her time now, and will never practice, because you don't practice ever again having 3 murder charges against you, right? And they're not going to be rescinded. She's already worked all the way through the California State Supreme Court, and they wouldn't even listen to her case. So she's done. As far as I know, there's no other legal recourse for her. So anyway, so on top of dealing with, the devastation of losing our son, and my immediate personal feeling that I needed to make a difference and get the word out, and establishing the NCAPD, the National Coalition Against Prescription Drug Abuse, that became a nonprofit. Joey died in December 2009, and by June 2010, we had the organization up and running. I was speaking even like a month after he passed away. I stood up and spoke at a parent education event that was talking about the prescription drug problem. It wasn't opioid specific at that point. It was about prescription drugs. And so our organization has never focused just on opioids. We certainly have a keen focus on it because it is such a big problem. But I will tell you that there is a not talked about, not discussed, but I believe a raging problem with benzodiazepines. In particular, they're used to treat anxiety. That would be things like drugs like Xanax, Ativan, Valium. We have a big problem, I think, with things like sleep aids like Ambien. That can be amnesia can affect, and people get up and do weird things in the middle of the night and don't even remember what happened to, what they did. So we have focused on all of those. And then it was about 2012 that I was really frustrated with my own county's public health care system, public health, meeting with the highest level officers within the county and, sharing our personal story and encouraging them, should say, insisting that they do more than they were doing. They really weren't focused on this issue. And so it took about 3 years. So bottom line is I established at that point, thinking that maybe I could get more support from the county entities, like public health and others. I established, on top of, in addition to NCAPDA, I established the Contra Costa County Meds Coalition. So MEDS, MEDS, stands for Medication Education and Disposal Safety. So both organizations, NCAPDA working at a federal level, we work wherever we want to, but with a keen focus on the California Bay Area, because that's where we live. That's where we're based. We actually provide fiscal sponsorship for the Meds Coalition. I lead that coalition also. And that's how I came to know Sarah, of course, as I mentioned. So it was really to pull in the county officials and to really get people involved and to understand that this was not an emerging problem. It's now doubled or more in size, over time. When I first started giving presentations, as an example, to community members, whether they were youth or whatever, I think we had about 36,000 people that were dying a year back in 2010 from an overdose. It's now 80,000 people in 2020, and we're expecting that 2021, we could grow to have over 100,000 people die from overdose. And it's not just from prescription drugs, right? It's more and more the case that we're seeing fentanyl as an illicit opioid tainted overdoses. So fentanyl is showing up in the powder form. Other drugs are being adulterated with it. So you're finding fentanyl in cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, even marijuana showing up in to give it an extra boost, like you need it. And so it's showing up everywhere. And just a few specks of that can kill you. It's extremely potent, extremely dangerous. Additionally, drug dealers will take the powder form and they'll create what look to be real pharmaceutical medications like Xanax, like all the medications that people are looking for, the most abused. So Vicodin, Percocet, Norco, certainly Xanax, those are showing up on the street. People are buying, trading, buying, whatever, and they're fentanyl. They're either pure fentanyl or they're laced with fentanyl. We've got to get a handle on the prescription opioid prescribing levels. Before, we connected here, I was actually literally on a computer putting together a letter that we're going to send out to all sorts of sports leagues, baseball, whatever it may be. Because in California, we actually passed a law a couple of years ago that I don't think most coaches even know about, that say that before the season starts, so as registration's happening, the student athlete and their parent, if they're under 18, they are supposed to receive an opioid fact sheet that was put together by the CDC that really basically delineates the dangers, the safety elements for opioids, because it's not uncommon for student athletes to get injured. Sports injuries are inevitable. Typically, pain is involved, obviously. Now, it may be mild to severe pain, but it's not uncommon for opioids to be prescribed even for mild pain in a sports injury situation. So if the kids and their parents don't know that, hey, these can be addictive, if you mix them with alcohol or with other substances, you can literally die from them, from overdose. They don't know. There's a very low perception of harm, even still, for prescription-related drugs. And the opioids are the ones that are probably the most immediately dangerous that we have to get the word out about. And they didn't see it coming. They didn't ask for it. They don't know what to watch out for. Even the CDC has said with their guidelines that they put out, I think in 2012, even post-surgically, either avoid them completely if you can, depending on your pain levels. You may not be able to do that, but minimize. Take those opioids for the smallest, the shortest amount of time possible. Doctors shouldn't even prescribe them for longer than 3 to 5 days. And they do. Often they'll give you a 30-day supply. Well, if you take them for 30 days, you are at high risk for developing an opioid use disorder. Your body's going to become dependent on them, meaning that you can't just stop without feeling the withdrawals from those opioids. They're going to make you really sick. When one person in the family has an opioid use disorder or any kind of use disorder, the whole family suffers. Friends, everybody that loves or cares about that person, they're part of the, they're caught up in this. It's a horrible cycle. So what our organization is trying to do is educate so people don't go down that path in the first place. So through education, policy change, legislative advocacy, where we have those opportunities, that's where we work. And we work with a lot of other organizations out there. When I first started NCAPDA, I felt like I was a lone ranger. And my concept initially was, okay, let's start this organization, try to build others out there so that by then I was starting to connect with other parents in particular who lost their kids. So what can we do to have them start a little local chapter and they can work under our umbrella? So over time, there was also another organization back in 2012 that I personally helped form. It was called the Fed Up Coalition and still exists. So I'm one of the executive what do we call ourselves? The executive steering committee members for that organization. And we work to drive federal action. So it's through our efforts and other organizations that we work with that, we've been able to stimulate a response from the president back in Obama's days. There had never been a word about this issue until, we wrote a letter saying, President Obama, this is a huge problem. We are parents, we represent parents from around the country. You need to step up and say something and do something about this issue. So just about the time he was leaving, he did. And then we had Trump come in. People love him, people hate him, whatever. It doesn't matter to us. The bottom line is, even in his inaugural speech, he mentioned for the first time any president had the opioid or the prescription drug and the opioid issue, and that he was going to plug money into it. And he did. That was the first stream of funding that we saw come down from our federal government.
What was your son prescribed that medication for?
Well, I mentioned that earlier. So he really had no problems. The key was pill and mill doctors, as this doctor was. They don't care what your problems are. So, he was coached on what to say when he went into the doctor's office by, kids at Arizona State that were going to her routinely, right? So all he had to do is say, I'm anxious. I got pain in my shoulder. But there was no exam. It was like, oh, okay, here you go. So it's just ridiculous. There was really no physical exam. And that's what got her into big trouble in the end, because she was really prescribing without medical reason. There were no medical reasons. And it was just a line out the door, one after another. Sometimes she was bringing multiple people into an exam room. I was there at the trial for the 2-month-long trial. And it was just incredible hearing all the evidence they had against her. It was ridiculous. And
what did she say? Like, did she say anything?
She was trying to help her patients. They didn't have a good defense. It was really just she was trying to help them. She wasn't trying to help them. She had made $5 million off of her business in about 3.5 years with the way she was prescribing, because she would collect money, cash in the door. There's probably no question at all that she was defrauding the federal government. Tax money wasn't being paid out on that cash. You can be guaranteed. They didn't even bother going after her for that, because they had her on all this other stuff. So they knew, they could tell. You can see these patterns of prescribing. And so she was reported by the pharmacies in her area. And that's why these young people, like even my son, went over 30 miles away to a pharmacy outside of her area. And ultimately, not only did we go after her, but we went after the pharmacy too. And so the pharmacy was actually shut down by the pharmacy board because of irregularities too. That used to happen back in the time frame when we got involved with this. It was really, 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 really bad with these pill mills down in Florida. And so they would actually have, like, in the same facility, it was like you prescribe it, and right next door and in connection with that doctor's office was the pharmacy that you would fill them with. They were losing at least 7 people, as I recall, a day in Florida at one point because of overdose, in just that one state alone, because of the pill mill activity there. It was horrible.
How did you find out what happened with your son?
It started the very night that we learned that Joey had died. The semester was done, finals were over, and the next day everybody was leaving to go home. So he had been out with his friends, celebrating her birthday and early graduation for another student. So he stayed there about 5 days after they finished their finals. And his girlfriend was done. She was not 21, so she couldn't go out and celebrate at the nightclubs with him. So she came back home to San Ramon, where we live. And they basically met each other in high school. So they were both attending the same college, but she came back early. So some of the early information we got directly from her, as we're waiting to hear, because we just initially knew that he had been found in his apartment unconscious, and we didn't really know until we talked to the Tempe Police Department that night whether he was alive or not. And so in the meantime, as my husband's on the phone with them and I'm talking to her, I'm thinking alcohol may be a problem, right? But I just remember saying, do you think drugs could be involved? Not really believing it could be true, because again, we really had never had a problem with that with Joey at all. So, and I remember her nodding her head, and I said, tell me what you know. And she said, he went to a dirty doctor last week. And I said, well, what is a dirty doctor? I didn't even know what that was. And she said, well, this doctor's just throwing pills out there. So she said he went there with a couple of friends. And so I'm concerned, it was clear that she thought it might be, the medications versus alcohol. So that night, then after, we learned that he was gone, we went back to our house, because we gathered as a family at my other son's house in San Ramon too when this happened. We went back home at about 2 a.m. We got a call from the Tempe Police Department detective that was, working through the case. And my husband thought to ask him, did you find medication vials in his room? And he said, yes. And so Joe asked him what the name of the doctor was on the vials, and he told us. So after that was over, that conversation was over, I remember going down to my computer and doing a Google check on the doctor's name. And on vitals.com, a website that people can leave reviews about doctors, I remember reading multiple comments about how she was a drug dealer in a white coat, that she was giving, all these drugs out to their kids, and, it wasn't stopping even when they called her and all this stuff. So I'm like on high alert. Here, Kelly, Joey's girlfriend, has already told me that she was a dirty doctor, and I'm getting online evidence that there was a problem there. So we got through the funeral, the day after Christmas, and then within a week after he had passed away, and that was all done, I called the DEA and reported him to the DEA, not really knowing exactly how this, what to do, but
how do you know how to navigate? Like, how did you know to call the DEA? I am so proud of you for not giving up. Look at you now. Oh my God.
Well, I'm pretty sure it was a friend that my husband had that's an attorney that he consulted with. And from what I remember, it was he who said, well, the DEA needs to know, because they oversee the medical community, and they're supposed to, if somebody is prescribing like this doctor was, they need to be involved. So I remember calling. I had to leave a voicemail message for the DEA. And within 45 minutes, I had a call back right away from, it turned out, the DEA agent who had been investigating this doctor for 2.5 years or more. There had already been an investigation underway for quite a while. And I remember thinking and just being like, why, what has she not been shut down before now? Why is it now, like another person coming in? So bottom line is, I gave them all the information they needed about Joey. Ultimately, I also did the same with the medical board, filed a medical board complaint. We ended up suing her and the pharmacy. And so those cases took a year or more, I don't know, a year and a half. We never even went to court. I mean, basically, she just rolled over and said, okay, fine. It was her insurance company, I suppose, that really paid in the end anyway. But yeah, it was. So we at least did our part in calling attention to her. Next thing you know, there are other families that are starting to also file lawsuits against her. So I think we were the first, probably 8 or 9 families that did the same thing. And we had been told also that if we filed a civil lawsuit, that if the award per se, the financial award, was more than $25,000, that information could apply to the other case, the criminal case that we knew was underway, that was being built. Overall then, like as they finally got the case built and they were ready to take action, by then it had been handed off to the Los Angeles district attorney. That district attorney I am forever grateful to, because this was a really, really difficult case. The general perception back in that time frame was, if somebody dies of an overdose, it's their fault. Doctors are good. They only do good work. They don't prescribe to make somebody die, right? And so there was a huge perception and the stigma around overdose and addiction that had to be overcome. And so it would have been very easy for the district attorney not to spend the many millions of dollars I know they ended up spending on this case. At the point they arrested this doctor, she was put in jail, of course, and they did not allow her to bail out because the money that she had to bail out with, they considered to be dirty money. It was money she made from this practice that was killing people. So she sat in jail for 4 years. It took that long for this case to come to trial. And so she's sitting in jail. And here I am checking in now and then with the medical board, with the DEA, to see, well, like, okay, where are we in this case? When is it going to come to trial? And so all along the way, just providing whatever information I could about Joey specifically, knowing that there were others out there, because ultimately I knew, especially with the preliminary hearing that happened, oh, by the way, on Joey's 23rd, what would have been his 23rd birthday, I learned, that there were all these other parts of the trial, but I didn't know what the particulars were until the actual trial took place, and all the inconsistencies about her business practice and people overdosing in her bathroom and yet not changing her practice. Her getting notified time and time again about, from the coroners from various counties around Southern California about another one of her patients dying, and still her not changing her practice. It was just disgusting.
How did she live with herself?
I don't know. I don't know. I remember telling a reporter, because of course the news was all over this. It was really a high profile case, a national case in scope. And, I remember talking to the media multiple times, just I don't know how she sleeps at night. I don't know how she can go to bed knowing she's killed all these people and did nothing. And I'm sure she's still not done. There are people walking around now that are still dealing with a substance use disorder that won't make it in the end, right? Eventually they'll overdose, or who knows how many people have gone to jail, have been incarcerated because of their addiction problems, that resulted in crime to support them, that stimulated from her prescribing. It's just disgusting. So,
How long was she in practice?
For that practice, she had started out, as I understand it, as a infectious disease doctor. So she was working in a hospital setting, but then she had a couple of children, and her family was encouraging her to leave that and go to work with her husband, who was also a doctor. So they were actually working together in the same practice. And so it's very interesting that she was the one that was, in effect, nailed, right, with these overdose deaths. He was practicing right beside her. That's the other thing that was disgusting. Like, if he wasn't doing this himself, and he knew, he had to know what was going on, because it had been just a family practice before. You make an appointment, you come in, there's a few people in the office, in the waiting room. This was where there were people literally out the door waiting. They'd get there hours earlier. They didn't even need appointments. They would just wait, take their turn to walk in. There's no doubt that her husband knew what was going on. In fact, after, her situation, it was either after she had been convicted or whatever, he was actually, the medical board did go after him. They suspended his license for 5 years, but they basically gave him an out and said that if you follow these rules, you get, some training on how to be a good doctor, right? This guy'd been in practice for years. So if you get the training, if you have to pay for this person to oversee your practice for the 5 years and report to us on a quarterly basis, then you can continue to operate. He deserved to be shut down too.
He deserves to be in the cell with her.
Yeah, I can't go so far as to say that, because I don't know what evidence they ever pulled together to say that he was responsible for overdose deaths, but there was complicity there. There had to be, and from my perspective. So anyway, he's still practicing. She's in jail. These little kids are growing up without a mom. She's not even eligible for parole. It was 30 years to life in prison without parole until at least 30 years have been served. I will tell you, just like 2 weeks ago, I checked to see if she's still in jail. They're supposed to notify me if anything changes, if there's a parole hearing or anything else, but I don't necessarily trust that I'll hear for sure. So I just go on, and I know what her case, like her prisoner number is, and I know how to get information. And so I know for sure as of 2 weeks ago, she was still sitting in jail down in Southern California. So
do you think you'll ever be able to be at peace?
More than anything, I just miss my son. And that's a daily thing. Pretty much every day, I would say I talk about Joey in some way. I'm talking to young people, I'm talking to adults, whatever, and I always use our personal story to help people connect to this being a real problem and real people being affected by it. So will I ever be at peace? I will miss my son forever. This shouldn't have happened to him. He should be with us. We've missed out a huge part of life with him. He's missed out on life, adult life, right? So there's no peace in that. I am happy that we've reached resolution with the doctor, primarily because she's never going to hurt anybody else, not at least by prescribing. So I'm at peace with that. We have reached closure with that situation. And I so regret and feel sorry for those families. And there are multitudes of them out there that have never reached closure and never will, because the drug dealer or the doctor who provided the drugs that their children or other family members died from, nothing ever happened to. So I feel very fortunate we have reached closure in that regard. There's peace in that, but there's no peace in the fact my son is gone and he should be with us, You don't lose a child and ever get over it. You just don't get over it. I've lost my mom, my dad, other members of the family. They were old, they lived their lives, they had their illnesses. Joey was healthy, he should have been. He should have thrived and graduated and gone on to all those, dreams, hopes, and dreams that he had for himself. And we will never know what those would have, been in the end.
Do you think about the good memories that you had with him?
Oh, of course, yeah. And the good thing is that my husband and I both retired really young. We were both in telecommunications. And so I was 48 years old when I retired. He was 49. And so that meant we were always with Joey. Joey was our world. He was our life. We have an older boy, but he was my son from our first marriage. And, bottom line is there was like almost 14 years between he and Joey. So he goes off to college. Joey's just going into kindergarten. So, I thankfully have grandkids and a wonderful, son and daughter-in-law and grandkids that are a core nuclear family. The key would be that when Joey was young, it was really kind of us, just Joe, I, and Joey, because Jim was off at college and later he was married and all that. So we just have wonderful memories. We did a lot of vacationing, like the outdoors. So we went to Alaska, we went on cruises, we liked to hike and camp. And yeah, so, and Joey was way into to sports. So 4 years old, he's playing soccer. And then he's playing very high level soccer, traveling teams and all that. And we were the typical soccer parents, and then we were the typical football parents because, by 8th grade, he wanted to play football, and that's what we did.
I feel like in college, like everybody does stupid experimenting.
Yeah.
I can't believe taking a couple pills and mixing that with alcohol could be instant. That's really terrifying.
No, it really is. And, it's like, it isn't necessarily instant. Like in his case, they weren't tainted with fentanyl. These were central nervous system depressants that slowed and stopped his breathing, but it would have happened over a period of time, several hours. So the other regrettable thing is, and another thing that our organization does also, I'll share with you, is that there was not Narcan or naloxone on hand. Do you know what that is? Have you heard of naloxone? Is that
where they can pump a shot into you really fast?
Yes and no. So naloxone is the generic term for an opioid overdose antidote medication. So in the past, if you called 911 because somebody was overdosing, they would show up with this medication. And that's what they would either inject or deliver in some other way for usually an injection. And so now because the opioid issue is so big a problem, almost every state I think now has Narcan, a spray version of naloxone available, super easy to administer, that can reverse an opioid overdose if you get to them soon enough. So Joey, I know, was left in his apartment alone in his room without anybody checking on him for hours and hours. And so he could have been saved with Narcan or now any form of naloxone, I'm sure of it. Because even though the Narcan only works on an opioid overdose, and again, in his system, he had alcohol and he had those benzodiazepines, Xanax, basically. If you just strip out one of those substances from the system, they can start breathing again, potentially, right? So I have no doubt he could have been saved with Narcan, but there's just no about it. It wasn't even available for the general population. It is now.
Can you talk to me about what an overdose does look like?
Yeah, basically symptoms would be, first of all, you can't rouse the person. So with an opioid on board, typically you're real sleepy, your breathing slows, of course. And there's a condition called nodding off. It's where we'd be talking, you and I would just like literally you're nodding off. You can't, converse. You're just kind of out of it. And then if that person just really just becomes unresponsive, they've collapsed, you're shaking them, you're pinching them, whatever you can to get their attention, and they're not responding. Especially, if you know that they've been using drugs of any sort, knowing that fentanyl could be in anything that they've taken in, that would be one thing. So it's mainly the breathing. It's your fingernails, your lips may turn bluish or purplish. And depending on your skin tone, that can vary, but it would be an unnatural look to your fingernails and your lips in particular. And you may be vomiting, you may be sweating, so those are the main things.
You said your son was going to this dirty doctor with friends. Were they trying to party?
Well, that's another part of the story. So my son lived with
And did they have any reactions, those friends that also?
No, the one of them we have been told, had an addiction issue. He could use way more than Joey ever would have been able to use because his body had adapted to those levels. And I think that the other kid, this was his first visit to that doctor too. So what the one student would do is he would go see this doctor once a month because you can't, you have to wait 30 days to get your next, prescriptions. And so he'd wait 30 days and then he'd invite other students to go with him. And it just so happened he ran into my son. They were out with some friends, and my son's problem was that he was living with two roommates that were fraternity brothers of his that had an addiction problem too. And so they were using this stuff. When Joey came home 3 weeks before he passed away, he let us know that these two roommates were not paying the rent or anything else anymore. They were using all the money from either jobs or family, their parents, to buy the drugs that they were hooked on, prescription drugs. And so we're sitting literally around the Thanksgiving table saying, like, well, this, again, keep in mind, we didn't know anything about prescription drug abuse and how prevalent it was and how deadly it could be. So we're just having this conversation about the fact that, we're paying for Joey's school stuff, and we just pay directly and get, pay for his room and board and give him money for food and all that. But we weren't going to pay for the other two boys too. Everybody's supposed to pay their share. So we're saying, well, Joey, it's not okay that they're not paying the rent. So you need to talk to him. And he's saying, I have talked to him. It's not doing any good. I don't know what to do. And so we're saying, well, we can call their parents. I wish we had now, knowing what I know now, but we didn't know. So no, I'll go back and talk to him again. And so again, 3 weeks later, he's dead, because he happened to run into these guys and they were going to go visit this doctor, knowing that his roommates and again, within his world there was so much prescription drug abuse going on, recreational abuse. He knew that he could go get that stuff and sell it in a heartbeat. And then he'd have the money to sustain the apartment until he graduated 4.5 months later. So horrible thinking, right? The brain of a 21-year-old kid that isn't fully developed is how I have to look at it. This was a horrible way to solve your money problem. It would have been far better to move him out of that apartment. Had we known, we would have done that, got him a different place. He didn't know. It was a lack of awareness and education. So,
and you probably wanted him to be independent and
well,
not be too...
and work his problems. He's 21.
Right.
I would say that he'd always had super support from it. Like, if he had a problem, he'd call his dad first, right? Because his dad would take care of, whatever's going on.
Better call daddy.
Yeah. And, that was okay. But, he's getting older. He's a 21-year-old, young man. And okay, let's let him try to work this out. Not realizing that those other boys, there was nothing that was going to change. In fact, 9 months to the day after Joey died, one of those two young men shot and killed himself in front of his girlfriend. He was so mired in prescription drug issues.
Oh my God, my heart.
Mental health problems. He had bipolar issues. Had no clue of before I talked to his mother after this horrific thing. Yeah, so that's what we were coping with there. 6 months after after he passed away, I got a Facebook message from a kid. I didn't even know they were the issue. And I remember him saying, can you help me? Was the little header on this thing. And when I contacted him, basically said, there is a doctor here in Tempe, Arizona, that opens up his office once a month. And my fraternity brothers flock to see him. He said like 70% of them have already developed an addiction to these pills. And so he was looking for me to help him shut this doctor down. He was graduating early in December, and he said, I don't know what to do. He said, I'm hoping you could shut this doctor down. I hope it's the last thing I can do for my fraternity because this doctor's going to kill him. So I took some action on that one too. And
is there anything that I didn't ask you that you would like to cover?
Let's see. I think that probably we'd want to say, like, what advice would you give parents? Because I think one of the biggest problems is, what advice I would give parents would be that they need to lock up their medication, first of all, right? You never know who's coming into your family or to your house that may be drug seeking, whether it's young kids that are friends of your teenagers or family members or neighbors or cleaning people, whoever comes into your house, may be seeking medications. And so don't be part of the problem, don't be a supplier unknowingly to someone who may be looking for those drugs. The other thing is learn where to drop off and get rid of your medications you don't need anymore. Because typically people just leave their stuff in their medicine cabinet. Over time, it expires. And just because it's expired does not mean it's dead. The medication, in fact, some of it actually becomes more potent over time, interestingly enough. So you want to get rid of it. Most of the time, CVS, Walgreens, these pharmacies are getting more and more of them in all of our states across the country are taking back medications. Typically, there's just a kiosk, a bin close to the pharmacy counter. You can ask the pharmacy. Also, a lot of the police stations have them too. What you don't want to do is throw the medication into the toilet or down the drain because it goes into the water system. Even if you put it in the trash, it goes into the water system eventually. So that would be one thing. And then parents need to, when they have a conversation about substance use with their kids, whether it's alcohol or illegal drugs, prescription drugs has to be part of the conversation. And they really, really need to understand that kids, if they want to find drugs, can find them easily. These social media platforms, TikTok, Snapchat in particular, right now are kind of hotbeds for drug activity.
That's terrifying.
It is terrifying, and they need to absolutely understand that fentanyl's in every community.
Wow. Thank you so much for having this conversation with me and like wanting to meet with me beforehand. Is there anything that you would like to ask my dad?
Did you learn something from this this podcast? How's that?
Yes, it was so good to connect with you. Please
Yeah, you
keep
too.
in
If
touch.
there's anything else I can do, let me know, okay?
Thanks for listening to the Better Call Daddy Show.
Now you can subscribe on Apple Podcasts,
Google Play,
Spotify,
iHeartRadio,
and TuneIn.
If you've enjoyed this episode of the Better Call Daddy Show, please feel free to review it
at ratethispodcast.com/BetterCallDaddy. Add Better Call Daddy Podcast on IG at Rena Friedman Watts on LinkedIn.com.